Hey Year 12s, it's time now to talk about task number 2, which is going to be an essay about Hitler's regime. So, when we're talking about Hitler's regime, you can talk about anything that takes place from the time that he takes power in 1933, and you can talk all the way up to when his rule ends in 1945 at the end of the war. So, basically with this task, using knowledge gained from classroom lessons, and I encourage you to do outside research, to do some of your own independent research as well, about the road to the dictatorship, and also the Nazi state during peacetime and also in wartime. We're going to try and complete the following essay question. So, dictators managed to seize control over all of society. How accurate is this statement? And I guess the first thing that we need to look at is to identify the key words. So, obviously when we see the word dictator, we're talking about Hitler. Okay, so Hitler managed to seize control over all of society. I guess the next word that I would look at is control. So what does it mean to control society? What does it mean for Hitler and the Nazi Party to have their influence over what takes place? The other word that I would have a look at is all. Okay, this is the bit that we have to argue about, whether it was all of society. So, did every single aspect of German society, was it taken over, was it controlled by the Nazis? And if it wasn't, then this statement isn't completely accurate, because we're looking at how accurate the statement is. Obviously, we could say that it is quite accurate, that it is very accurate, that it is extremely accurate. But we might also find that it is only somewhat accurate, or not at all accurate, that it is quite limited in its accuracy. So we need to make a decision about how accurate we actually think this statement is, how much we think Hitler actually managed to control every part of society. And so I've had to think about it, and I've come up with a list of a few examples, and I've tried to separate them into different ideas. Firstly, I've thought about the way that Hitler managed to gain political control. So I've considered, well, we've got the move from Hitler being Chancellor to becoming dictator, and I've got a few examples that I could make reference to, whether that be the Reichstag fire, the Night of the Long Knives, the Enabling Act, etc. In talking about the political control, I could also talk about the police state, which you had to watch a video about the other day. I could talk about the removal of other political parties, etc. So I've got a number of examples that I could draw upon to explain how Hitler managed to gain political control, and that would be a fairly decent paragraph there. I've also considered the way that the Nazis had control socially over the people of Germany, and so I've had a look at the control over women and young people, and with young people you could look at either education or the youth program, so Hitler Youth. I've had a look at the control over the minority groups, so the Jewish people particularly, but that's not to mention the gypsies and all those other minority groups that were around in Germany at the time. I've also considered how Hitler tried to bring about this social control through both propaganda and censorship. And so, socially, I think there are a number of examples there that we can draw upon. Thirdly, I've thought about economic control, how the Nazis managed to control the country economically. And so I've thought about the shift in culture that led to a reduction in unemployment for men, because obviously women had to take on the motherly role, the homemaker role, and so that meant that there were more jobs available for men. Of course, once the war began, then there were more jobs that needed to be filled by women. So, that shift in policy really didn't work out exactly the way the Nazis had hoped that it would. And so I've got three areas that I've gone, okay, this is where I think Hitler managed to gain control. Now, to me, I think that this statement is quite accurate. I think that Hitler did manage to gain control over a fair proportion of society, but I don't think that he necessarily had control over the entire German society. And this is the key with essays in history, being able to write a counter-argument. So we see a statement like this and we go, yep, okay, there's evidence that we can use, all of these three paragraphs here, evidence that we can use to suggest that that is true, that Hitler did have control over society, but the essays that get the higher grade bands, A grades, need to have a counter-argument, a paragraph that explores the opposite, or an alternative view. So when it comes to this statement, we need to consider, well, what ways did Hitler not have control? How did Hitler not have control over every single part of society? And so, 3 questions that I would want us to consider. 1, who challenged Nazi rule? Secondly, how successful were those people who challenged Nazi rule? And you might want to just look at, well, why weren't they successful in the end? So, we just need to consider that Hitler didn't have full control. And if he didn't have full control, why was that? And how did that play out? We have looked at that in class, in parts. Surprise test number 4 had some information about that, and some of you took that with you, some of you left it here. So you might need to do some of your own outside research in order to put together a really well-constructed counter-argument. Some other things to think about. I think I've talked about these in a previous video, but if you consider the aims, the methods, and the appeal of the Nazi movement, the consolidation of power, the creation of the totalitarian state, so Hitler having full control, the experience of Nazism for people and for groups, and the impact of the Second World War. If you can look at each of those things somewhere in your essay, then you're going to be doing pretty well. You also need to reference any idea that is not your own. So I don't care which referencing system you use, as long as it is consistent the whole way through. My personal preference would be for footnoting. It's easier to read, the footnotes won't count in your word count also. So that would be my preference. There's videos on this channel that can show you how to go about doing that. The due date for the draft, should just make that little change. The draft due date, the 23rd of March, and then the final copy will be due on the 29th of March. This is an essay of 1,000 words. That is the word count. Can't go over 1,000 for this particular task. And these are the things that I'll be marking you on. So, understanding and exploration number 2, the understanding and exploration of the role of ideas, people, and events in history. Secondly, I'll be looking for the use of evidence to support arguments and draw conclusions. So, I want to see historical evidence. That means I would like to see quotes, whether that be from historians or primary data, whether you can make reference to specific unemployment figures or the different perceptions, I suppose, of different historical events. So when I've given you handouts about historians' views, that's what I'm looking for you to use. Number 3, communication of reasoned historical arguments with acknowledgement of sources. I need to see that bibliography in there, and I need to see appropriate referencing, as well as just really clear communication. That's why we go through the drafting process. Those of you who drafted your work did a whole lot better in the first task than those who didn't. Okay. The last criteria, the analysis of short-term and long-term impacts. So when we look at whether Hitler had full control, of course, short-term, we're looking at the immediate impact of different things that took place, like the Reichstag fire. What was an immediate impact of that? Well, the communists were arrested, etc. A long-term impact of that is that Hitler was able to gain much greater power in the Reichstag and eventually get the Enabling Act passed, and he would become dictator. That's a long-term impact. So really important that you consider both the short-term and the long-term in this essay. And so there is the rubric. Obviously we're looking for comprehensive understanding, a discerning use of relevant evidence. So I'm looking for you to be really specific about the evidence that you choose, looking for well-reasoned and coherent and insightful historical arguments, and critical analysis. So if we can get those things into our essays, we're going to be doing really, really well. I look forward to reading your drafts very soon.